So I'm Hugh Davies. I'm an artist and games designer sometimes. I was invited about 18 months ago to create a project, or I was funded essentially through my job to create a project that looked at Indigenous components in the Melbourne CBD. It was very ambiguous. And I've worked a lot in creating pervasive games previously. Troy on the end and I have collaborated quite a few times in looking at pervasive games. When this project was mentioned to me, I'd just come back from Japan, like literally been back in the country for hours, and I was looking at a prehistory of Pokémon Go in Japan, sort of tracing a very Japanese-centric history of that game to things like temple and shrine walks and stamp collecting and insect collecting in Japan, and very aware of, I suppose, something that Troy and I have discussed and a lot of people have discussed, which is there was such a big area of pervasive games practice that no one really knew about until Pokémon Go came out. And then suddenly it was like we could talk about what we were doing, people understood. But another thing that Pokémon Go really brought up was this idea of like, in playing games, you're kind of colonising, playing pervasive games, you're kind of colonising place as well, without any attention to what has been in that place before, who has associations with that place, not just in the past, but in the present and the future. And I thought those were really interesting ideas that needed more explanation, more exploration. I felt very confronted when it was suggested that I create a project that looked at Indigenous culture in terms of place, because I said, look, I'm a white cis guy in my 40s. I'm sort of, why are you getting me to do this? And why are you not speaking to like a local Indigenous community? And to which the response was from Professor Mark McMillan, that's exactly why we're getting you to do it, because we think it's an important thing for you and people like you to be looking at. So really challenging me to sort of say, have a look at this, engage with this notion of place, engage with the history of this place, and do it through your practice. Make it part of your practice, make it part of who you are and what you do as a researcher, which I thought was like quite an excellent and challenging response. So I spent the next, I guess the other thing was they wanted something like very quickly, and I immediately slowed things down and said, we want to do something a lot slower. We want to talk to a lot of stakeholders and find out a lot of history. And one thing I did was co-opt some people into this project. Troy, who I've worked with many times before, Olivia, who was the first time I was working with her, and Carolyn as well, who had a whole lot of stories of place from NARM, from where we are standing right now. I said to my panellists that we'd speak for maybe 2 minutes each. I've spoken for 5. I think I'm going to throw over to Troy and just maybe he can mention some of what he's done as well. Troy?
Sure, thanks Hugh. My role in this project is primarily as a pervasive game designer, so I'm going to frame my experience through that lens. And there's a couple of things I want to kind of look at. First thing is over the last 10 years or so, I've been situating games and play in cities, and one of the goals or primary goals that I've tried to achieve is something that's been very elusive from the point of view of game design, which is to engage people, the players playing these games, with a deeper connection with the urban environment. You know, not just you made reference to Pokémon Go, and our analysis of that game is, oh, okay, it's kind of fun, and it was a phenomenon, and got people out off the couch and did things. But that game encodes the city with the aesthetic of Nintendo, and the games that I'm making are more interested in decoding the city, so kind of trying to connect people with all the layers of what's there, not what's just there right in front of you, but all of the historical layers, all of the social layers, all the cultural layers. And from the point of view of a game designer, that's incredibly hard to do. So when this opportunity came up, it was really kind of jumped at the chance, and I was already working with Olivia on projects that were about activating place and about relating people to place in different frameworks. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic, because here is this opportunity to work with cultural knowledge that has been working, before we had smartphones, obviously, for tens of thousands of years, that are achieving many of the goals of pervasive game design. But it's also really problematic, because I don't want to just take tens of thousands of years of cultural knowledge and say, oh, this is great game design, this is really handy, thank you for that. And it's about also this kind of negotiation, this kind of translation of that process. So while we've just built a prototype, I guess for me as a game designer, it'd be fantastic not only to translate situated storytelling into this kind of project, but also the actual processes that connect people with place, and try to develop game mechanics and situations and processes that put people into that relational kind of situated position in connection with urban environments or landscape more generally.
I'll just interrupt before I hand over to you, Olivia. The prototype that we've created is called Timer, and basically what it is, it's an audio app pervasive game whereby you download the app to your phone, you scan these codes that Troy is quite renowned for as an artist. They're augmented reality. They open up and they give you choices for whereabouts on campus you want to navigate. It's all based at RMIT campus. And there's a small level of kind of multiple choice where you see in the IA on directions that you want to travel, and you listen to audio of Olivia and Carolyn giving you understandings of histories of place and realities of place, layers of place that a lot of people weren't aware of. And in the trials that we've done, people seem to have very strong and resonant experiences just listening to those audio stories and navigating quite familiar territory. Olivia, did you want to?
A large part of this project was about me paying my respect to the land on which we gather today. So just as a preamble, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded land on which we gather today, and I'd also like to acknowledge Auntie Carolyn and First Nations people in the room today, as a way to highlight my relationship to place, as well as being a migrant myself, and what that means to me. And a large part of this project, and you're probably all wondering, what the hell is this project? And I can say that in essence it was about layering stories of country over the physical landscape, so people navigating to different sites and really showing people how different people related to place. And about a year ago I had the opportunity to listen to some of Auntie Carolyn's stories. She created these 3 to 5 minute audio stories which were about her own history and the history of her people. Some of them were, one was a creation story about Bunjil, the eagle, another was a story about water, there were some sky stories in there, and there's a really beautiful story about her great-grandmother, Louisa Briggs, who was a powerful voice for Aboriginal people during the mission days of settlement. And for us creating this app, it wasn't so much about representing these stories. We wanted to move away from this idea of representing stories because they weren't our stories. And instead what we wanted to do is invite people to respond to those stories. So I asked a few people to to listen to some of her stories and then to create a response to it. Because what was important for us was really to try and encourage people to connect with place in quite a deep and reflective way. Not just in terms of, well, I relate to, I know about Indigenous history and people and places, but more in terms of, well, sometimes there are aspects of this history that I don't know about. You know, we often walk through places and we don't know about the history of that place from a local Indigenous perspective. And so rather than create a sense of tension there, it was really about creating a sense of dialogue, seeing places as open and progressive rather than defensive and trying to shut down dialogue around what is a place, so what has happened on this place, whether that's a traumatic history or not, or whether you might not understand the history of it. How can we invite people in a safe and culturally a culturally safe environment for them to have a dialogue with or a connection with that place? So a lot of the feedback that we got from people who played this game or experienced this particular app was, wow, we really felt a different sense of engagement with the place. We didn't know about that. We didn't know about that history. And let's hear more stories, or how can I contribute? So, and that was really exciting for us to hear this kind of response from people who experience this game.
And I'm Carolyn Briggs, and an elder in residence here at RMIT. And I'm not a gamer. I'm only impacted when my grandchildren want me to play their little game or their Nintendos and things like that, and you go, okay, teach me. And they get frustrated with me because I'm not up to speed. But that's okay. I was at the part of the festival we just finished last night, and a young lad come up to me and he said, Auntie, I want to do a virtual reality because it's in what we want to do all over Australia. Develop that virtual reality and teach little people how to walk through country and hear the stories of country, because then it's about people and place. And I thought, gosh, I just heard something about that from Olivia. And I wanted them to come along, but as young family members, they're home with their family. But it'll inform me to pass this on to this young man. Apparently they're doing it in Brisbane, then they're mapping country and language groups and stories within those language groups that are uniquely to place, not just at the beautiful city that we live in, but there's many layers within this part of Melbourne, and being confident for myself as an elder to share those stories that you probably would never have heard of. So that's partly why Olivia wanted me to be here today after 11 days of Uramoy. Uramoy means the future's tomorrow. But like I said, I was with the architect students yesterday, or landscape architects yesterday, and I said, you know, I walk around this city and I can't find me in it. I can have places that it triggers memories of certain things when I've looked at early maps. Then I can create the stories. And I've got a wealth of stories. And it's your stories because you live here. And people need to understand. But it'd be great to ask you to help invest in these stories, because these are the futures for young people. And us elders are moving on. There will be emerging elders, but they don't have the stories because we were privy to have our elders pass those stories on to us. So that's my doctorate, is about looking at transferring my knowledge to our urban youth. And you being a part of that, it's your stories too. And we're elevating our young people through language, song and story. So we can't do this in isolation. We've tried to play it, do it. And I look at young little gamers and I go, wow. Never understood it though. I was in Los Angeles somewhere and I saw all these young people travelling and they said they're gamers. And I thought, whatever that was. I was naive to it. But they're obviously coming up with new ways of communicating and being able to channel their amazing skills. I never grew up with it. I probably never grew up with books other than the Bible. So, and good values. So this is why it's important to think about place and people and the history makers. We weren't the silent partners in this journey, but we've been forgotten about, and we have to resurrect that. And it is about research, and it's about how we move through in a global position for bringing opportunities for young people to play those games, because there's amazing stuff out there and there's amazing stuff that you will all learn to create, hopefully with us and not in isolation of us. Thank you. Done my 5 minutes?
Thank you. So yeah, we're covering a lot of territory here, so to speak. We're talking about tens of thousands of years of local history and condensing a glimpse of that into an app that people can access because they get Pokémon Go. So this sort of set of swirling ideas, I suppose, is quite difficult to discuss in this format. Perhaps maybe one of the best things to do is to invite questions from the audience, which I think that we would all really enjoy. Is it too quick to do that?
No, we can do that.
Great. That would be very valuable to us.
Really, really fascinating idea. I guess I'm kind of curious about like what kind of time frame you imagine this going into the future. Like, is this going to be an app people can play a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Like, have you sort of had those considerations of like the kind of permanence of this project?
We have had some discussions and ideas about the permanence and the legacy of this project. Because it's been sort of institutionally funded, it is just a prototype at the moment, but it's something that we're looking for future funding for to further prototype and sort of make permanent, because it isn't permanent at the moment. There's an online version of it, but the app version of it requires access to QR codes, which are no longer in place. Sorry, not QR codes, but AR codes, which are no longer in place. What we would ideally like to do is to make it a permanent installation. There's a couple of images up here of which we used for the prototype of a young woman of Chinese descent, because we specifically targeting it for new students to RMIT. And like, people are probably aware, when you're a new student at RMIT or at any university, you spend the first 2 weeks of like running around campus trying to sort of, do puzzles and games and one thing and another to orient you into sort of where different buildings are, where the toilets are, where the cafe is. But we sort of realised there's a lot of geographical knowledge that isn't being communicated. And it can't be communicated in, let's solve this puzzle as fast as we can and beat the other team kind of format. But we actually want to target that community of people. So creating this project, which is much slower, it's audio. It requires you to slow down and to move through the campus and to understand the layers of the place and the histories of the place, and to contribute to the futures of place.
I can talk to the process a little bit. So in my introduction, I jumped straight into what the core experience was without explaining any of the mechanics. So thanks, Hugh, for explaining a few of the mechanics that we've put in place in the game. But really, we'll probably throw all those out because, it's contingent on resources and support. It's just us at the moment. But ideally, it would be something that we introduce to the community within a year, perhaps, but then it's going to be an ongoing process. And the design and because there's that immediate goal of situating the stories, and that is something that's probably achievable. But then there's this really, really super long-term goal that's much more abstract, which is, well, how do you actually situate people in the way of being that generates those stories? And that could take a decade, and we might never get there, but that's the aspirational goal. But really the process is, and this is why we're here, is participatory, so bringing people into that process. So getting things out there, even if they're a bit broken and not working, so that we can get feedback, it's really important. But when it will be done, who knows?
But I think it like anything, it evolves and adapts.
Yes. Yeah,
Sorry.
exactly. That's the whole idea.
No, anything, and the demand on us now is to speak language through kindergartens, and so we had to go and learn how to be linguists and how to write something that was oral. So we had to scaffold our own process to put it into a written form, and then be able to hear remembering the sound system to create a sound system. And we're getting there, but it's happening, and we just love to have the tools to do it. I've written a book, written the sound system, and created stories from that. So the next stage will be other elements of how you write stories. That it keeps evolving. I've got 1 million stories. I have my own imagination, but it's about how to try and bring old stories into the new premise that children, young people can learn from. Values, yes.
Just in terms of, so we have sort of a room here of very highly skilled people in the sort of fields that you are interested in helping sort of build what you're kind of creating. How do people get involved? How do people kind of, how do you want people to help kind of do it? How do you want people to help engage with the community?
Just asking the question like that is amazing. Because everybody offers, but when we ground it, it's finding the people who want to invest themselves in it and build a stronger partnership, meaningful engagement. Where am I based? At Ngarara Willim Centre? Are you all from RMIT? Wow. Are you all different areas in different places? Different states? And different countries? Wow. Okay. Well, find your own communities. Work with your communities. It was like my daughter, if you ever been to the museum in Melbourne, one of the issues was that in Melbourne we're not seen as a people because of the impact of colonisation over the many hundreds of years, so 230 years. So a lot of people don't know their history other than Captain Cook, if you think about our history of Melbourne or Australia. But it goes deeper than that. And they're the stories we gather and put together. For meaningful engagement is to get to know your communities, wherever you come from. Like my daughter had to travel around to First Peoples around the world to see how they're portrayed in these institutions, like a museum, instead of artefacts, just skulls and remains. We're living cultures. Just like you, we are living human beings, and we all have something to contribute. So she was able to develop the First Peoples, and people invested in that to make us more visible to this landscape. So something like this will trigger people to invest, and skills like you young people and older people have got to offer. But know your own communities, and know maybe there's people out there and they're mobilising just like you young people or older peoples that are bringing different ways of seeing. And this is challenging the Western paradigm, do you know? Using the tools of the Western knowledge. But it's something we've been thinking about but just didn't know, for me as an older person, to know how to act or have the privilege to be able to sit down and learn. You know, it's like my grandson, he was 3 and he said, "Oh, that's my Nai up there, she's First Peoples." And he's Chinese, so he goes, "That's my Nai." And of course the rest of the Chinese said, "How's she your grandmother?" But he went through the explanation to tell them a story about his Nai, his grandmother. So these are the things our kids will not feel like the marginalised other, but he had a pride that he could share with other little people, and that's what we're trying to do. That everybody shouldn't, we're not the silent partners, and we want to be a part of sharing this growth with all of you, because everyone has a story to tell wherever they come from. And skills. I'd love to know how to do all this stuff, but I don't give myself that privilege. I'm doing too many other things, distracting myself. But thank you for asking. I'm here. Olivia somewhere supervises me.
She supervises me, really.
She chases me. But I'm over at RMIT near the Ngarara Willim Centre, and people find me there a couple of days a week, or I'm out doing community work. But I'd love to see young people. And when a young Indigenous fellow come up to me and he said they're starting it off in Brisbane, so they're really being rigorous in mapping and working with communities. This is a better way of building meaningful partnerships. Thank you. Did that help you? You were here in Melbourne?
No, I'm Canberra-based.
Okay, they've got lots of stories. Thank you.
I'm aware we've got to wrap it up soon. Chad's given me the nod. I think maybe we have time for one more question. Just in terms of what people can do as well, I would love to say, oh, look, you know, we're going to be testing the app and we'd love to, you know, come and have you give it a go and hear some stories and stuff. I'm not sure when we're doing that again next. I think something that's really valuable that I think it was Olivia that pointed out to me was just in terms of approaching this, she said, like, where are you? Where are you from? Like, that as a what you can do, I think is a great place to start. Like, just sort of, yeah.
I think, where are you from and what's your purpose?
Yep.
That means Womanjika. Woman, come, asked to come, dear. And Ka means, what is your purpose for being? What are you here for? To share all these amazing skills that you young people have scaffolded over the years with this technology that terrifies me. So, but I admire you. Wish I had the skill.
But it's technology and approaches to the world that perhaps are really ideally matched to living culture and the expression of that.
And using those as, helping people guide them.
Can we quickly squeeze that question in?
Thank you. So you mentioned obviously that the development of this is going to depend a lot on the resources provided. But do you already have any ideas for how to spread the word widely once you reach a point, or if you reach a point where you're ready to release? Do you have any ideas for pushing into that general mindset of consciousness that this actually exists and it's there for them to use it, and actually encourage people to use it?
As I say, at this stage, we're looking at promoting it among incoming students to RMIT, but seeing how we can build it. At this stage, we've just built a prototype. We're not sure how we're going to sort of target it out to people or mainstream publicise it and that sort of thing. But as I say, I mean, this project is just one way of doing something that you're actually fully enabled to do yourself anyway, which is to find out where you're from and what your purpose is. You know, I live here in Melbourne, in the Woiwurrung and Wurrung language groups of the Kulin Nations, but I'm from Darwin. I was born in Larrakia country, in saltwater people country. So just having an awareness of those histories of where you are as a person, you don't need an app for. The app will give you some of that history, but you can talk to people of place, of country. Yeah, I encourage you to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it may end up not being an app at all. It might be a set of rules or ways of approaching the world that anyone can try anywhere.
I think that's everything. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.